Hi, good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to our colloquium this afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the colloquium talk by Professor Anita Padmanabhanunni, who is the head of Department of Psychology at the University of the Western Cape. And Prof is also a registered counselling psychologist, and her areas of interest are in the area of trauma and PTSD. Anita has undertaken quite a bit of research on the mental health impacts of COVID as well, with a specific focus on identifying psychological mechanisms underlying resilience and coping. And she's published extensively in her field and presented her research at national as well as international conferences. She teaches on a variety of modules, including research methods, diagnostics, and psychological interventions, and introduces students to the relationship between research and clinical practice and the necessity of evidence-based practice in mental health care. Anita's community outreach activities are aligned to her research and teaching and are directed at the professional psychology community and at promoting the adoption of evidence-based psychological interventions. Anita, we are so thankful for you joining us this afternoon. And if you would like to share your screen, then I will hand over to you. So colleagues, this afternoon, I would be grateful if you could keep your microphones on mute, as well as turn your cameras off for the time being, just to save bandwidth. Anita will do her presentation for us, and then we will welcome comments and questions at the end. As comments come up for you throughout the course of her presentation, please do pop them in the chat, and we will then run through them sequentially at the end of her talk. So Anita, thank you once again, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Bronwyn. Thank you for the invitation to present today, and thank you to colleagues for joining the presentation. My name is Anita. I am the head of the Department of Psychology at the University of the Western Cape. And my presentation today is focusing on experiences of vicarious trauma among female psychologists who treat survivors of sexual assault. I think we are all very familiar with the statistics for rape in South Africa, and we're all aware of the extent of the problem. And almost 20 years ago, Carolyn Dempster said that a woman born in South Africa has a greater chance of being raped than learning how to read. And unfortunately, this is still very much the case in the country, and we're all very much aware of the extent of perpetration of sexual assault, and that women are the majority of the victims of sexual violence. It's also important to bear in mind that the statistics only reflect cases that are reported to the authorities, and underreporting is a significant problem, and it's influenced by social stigma around rape and also about the nature of the relationship with the perpetrator and possible sometimes financial reliance on perpetrators. So the statistics only represent a portion of cases that are actually reported to the authorities. There have been various attempts to conceptualize the mental health impact of sexual assault. And one of the earliest conceptualizations was by Burgess and Hallstrom, who developed the conceptual model called rape trauma syndrome. And this conceptual model was based on their clinical observations of survivors of sexual assault, and it essentially details the experiences of the survivor in the immediate aftermath of the assault and also their long-term trajectory of recovery. And the features of rape trauma syndrome were subsequently subsumed under the diagnostic category of post-traumatic stress disorder in the DSM. PTSD represents one of the few diagnostic categories to incorporate the findings of the feminist literature on the impact of violence against women. And it offers a means of validating the psychological harm that arises from sexual assault and the distress that is evoked through such experiences. So although these conceptual models are very important in terms of our understanding of the impact of sexual assault and in terms of planning treatment and in understanding what the survivor goes through, what we work with in the context of psychotherapy is it's different in some ways. And in therapy, what the psychologist or what the clinician deals with is more around the subjective experience of rape for the survivor. And every survivor's experience is distinctive, but there are certain broad categories of feelings and meanings that capture the core features of the experience of sexual assault. And this is what I mean by the phenomenology of sexual assault. I'm going to spend a bit of time detailing some of the core features of the subjective experience of sexual assault for the survivor. And this is aimed at providing a sense of what the therapist or the clinician confronts in the context of psychotherapy. And what I'm presenting here is based on research that I've done with female survivors of sexual assault and women who have lent their story to go towards research purposes. So one of the core themes that arises from survivors' narratives is around fear. And fear is common in terms of exposure to all types of traumatic events. But in the experience of sexual assault, there is the physical incapacitation of the victim and fear associated with bodily harm. Then there is the subsequent fear of encountering the perpetrator in the environment and the fear that this engenders. And there's also fear around the potential negative responses of significant others. So one of the women that I treated who had been exposed to a gang rape, and she was a university student and she had been gang raped in her community, and she describes fear in this way. A few weeks after the rape, I thought I was ready to go back to varsity, but I felt so afraid. I was afraid of going out of the house because I always had this thought. What if they're there? I was just afraid. I didn't want anyone walking behind me, especially men. I didn't want anyone staring at me for too long. I was so scared. I felt so exposed and vulnerable. Another common theme in terms of the subjective experience of sexual assault is around helplessness and powerlessness. And this is because, unlike other forms of traumatic events, sexual assault entails the physical incapacitation of the victim and the violation of their bodily integrity. So as one survivor put it, it's horrible for me to think that I did say no, and I did say please stop, and I did try to push him off of me. Something that I always think about is the feeling of being absolutely alone and powerless. I keep thinking I should have fought the whole way through, but I just couldn't. I physically couldn't. Helplessness and powerlessness can also be engendered as a consequence of the criminal justice system and the lack of prosecution of perpetrators. This can also lead to the victim feeling that they have no recourse in terms of seeking justice. Most people who have experienced a traumatic event don't necessarily blame themselves for the trauma having occurred. But for victims of sexual assault, self-blame is common in terms of their subjective experience. And as one survivor said, I can't explain the feeling of self-blame because I know I haven't done anything wrong. But maybe if I didn't go there that day, if I screamed, if I tried to run away, maybe it wouldn't have happened. And self-blame can evoke significant feelings of guilt and shame for survivors, and it is related to rape myths that are prevalent in society and also victim-blaming attitudes that hold the victim responsible in some way for the sexual assault having occurred. For victims of rape, self-blame can be characterological in nature, where the victim ascribes the rape to something about their character. Or it can be related to behavioral self-blame, which involves the victim blaming, attributing the rape to something that they have done or had not done. And self-blame is related to our need to maintain a belief in a just world, and we tend to want to believe that bad things don't necessarily happen to good people. And that is part of the narrative that underlies self-blame. In terms of disconnection, rape survivors often feel set apart from other people in some way. They feel as though the rape, it makes them different from other people, and they also have a sense that no one may really understand their experience. So one of the survivors that I worked with said, no one understands. I know everyone's situation is different. If it happened to my friend, she would have different emotions, but I can't imagine anyone understanding because it was the worst feeling I've had in my life. Feeling alone and no one cares, and I can't imagine anyone ever feeling that. That was the worst part. A sense of disconnection can also arise as a consequence of negative reactions from significant others. So the woman that I treated who was gang raped in her community, she at a later stage disclosed this to her father. And he said to her, people don't need to know about this. You don't have to tell anyone. People are just going to feel sorry for you, and it's not going to help you. So these types of attitudes can contribute to a sense of feeling disconnected and alienated from your significant others and from the world around you. Since the majority of rapes are perpetrated by people who are known to the survivor, significant other, or an acquaintance, it can contribute to a significant sense of betrayal of trust, and it can lead to a mistrust of men and a mistrust of others. So one of the women that I worked with was sexually abused in childhood over an extended period of time. And she said that I've always viewed the world differently since then. I've come to believe that other people are not what they seem. They capitalize, so it's important to be wary, be careful. So I guess I'm more suspicious of other people's motivations. So I've gone through some of the subjective experiences of sexual assault, and these are common narratives in survivors' accounts of their experiences, but there are also other themes such as anger, where survivors experience strong feelings of anger towards themselves, towards the perpetrator, towards the criminal justice system or society in general. There's also a theme around disgust and contamination and feeling as though the rape has stained them or made them dirty in some way. Then intrusive memories are also a core feature of PTSD, and survivors experience intrusions that are triggered by people, places, or events that serve as a reminder of the traumatic event. And when they experience an intrusion, it's as though they are reliving an aspect of the trauma all over again. There's also a change in one's personal identity that can arise as a result of exposure to sexual trauma, and survivors often find that they have to construct or reconstruct their sense of self that includes the experience of sexual trauma in their life story. Judith Herman spoke about recovery from sexual trauma, and she captured the process very well in terms of speaking about the central task of recovery being the establishment of safety. And this is safety both in the external environment, but also safety in the context of the therapeutic relationship, feeling as though there is someone who genuinely understands, wants to bear witness, and wants to hear what you've been through. And once that safety is established, the next task is around remembrance of what occurred and mourning the losses that have been engendered by the assault. And the third stage is around reconnecting with ordinary life and rebuilding adaptive meaning structures. Now, the process of guiding a survivor through recovery and of bearing witness to a survivor's journey it comes at a particular cost. And that cost is what is often referred to as vicarious trauma. And vicarious trauma is more likely, or psychologists who work with certain types of traumatic events are more likely to experience vicarious trauma compared to other mental health professionals. And this is because of the nature of the therapeutic process itself. The clinician guides the survivor to revisit and reconstruct a narrative around their trauma. And this involves being exposed to the very lived experience of rape and the suffering that is engendered by such acts. My current presentation draws from a number of studies that I've worked on with my students and independently, and some of this work focused on understanding the phenomenology of rape for the survivor, while other studies focused on understanding vicarious trauma and the subjective experiences of practitioners who work predominantly with survivors of traumatic events. The methodology for these studies, they were qualitative in nature, and it involved either interpretive phenomenology or thematic analysis, and it focused on lived experiences of practitioners. All the participants in these studies were mental health care providers in the Western Cape province, and I think what you'll notice in the studies is as the years go by, the number of participants tend to increase, and this is mostly related to the journal requirements, that although we know that in qualitative research we typically use a small sample to actually be recognized and published, it requires a much larger sample size, but this puts a lot of pressure on researchers to interview more and more people to meet that criteria. So for the present presentation, there were about 15 women who participated in these interviews, and they were all clinical or counseling psychologists. They had a mean age of 38 years, and they had been in the profession for an average of about 7 years, and they saw between 3 and 6 cases of sexual assault per week, which I feel is quite heavy work. In terms of the recruitment process, we advertised the aims of the study on professional networks for psychologists, and also liaised with NGOs, and through word of mouth we were able to recruit participants. Semi-structured interviews were conducted with each of the participants, and these were recorded, transcribed, and analyzed. Then this brings us to the core of the presentation, which is around the phenomenology of vicarious trauma for female psychologists who treat survivors of sexual assault. And these were the core themes to emerge from the clinicians' narratives. And I'm going to discuss each of them individually. So when we hear about the statistics for sexual assault, or when we hear about stories of sexual assault in the media, there is still a certain degree of distance that we keep from those experiences. But when you are confronted with a survivor in the context of the therapeutic relationship, that distance disappears and the experience becomes all the more real. And it leads to therapists recognizing the actual extent of sexual violence in the country, and also its impact on those who have been victimized. So one of the themes that the clinicians in the study spoke about was the recognition that the world can be malevolent. And this was encapsulated in the following quote. So a clinician said, "I feel absolute horror. I mean, I'm aware of these things, but when I hear them firsthand, it's very different. A good word to describe it is absolute horror at how human beings can hurt other human beings in a way I can never get used to." Another clinician said, "It feels like the ugliness of it seeps into me, and sometimes these cases, they leave me stuck in a place of despair." Working with sexual trauma and survivors of sexual assault on a regular basis can also lead to clinicians feeling an increased sense of personal vulnerability to sexual assault. And this was captured in the following quote by one of the clinicians, who said, "I haven't been through sexual trauma in my life, but now it's top of my list of fears. It is something that I think about a lot. It makes me feel vulnerable. It makes me feel like I'm not out of the loop. I'm never going to be out of the loop. I could become a statistic any point in time." Another clinician said, "Women are vulnerable and women get raped. This is our reality, so I expect to get raped." And this was quite a jarring statement to make, and I experienced it as quite jarring, because there is the expectation that it is inevitable and it is going to happen. And this was because of the frequency of their exposure to trauma work in the context of therapy. Then, because the majority of rapes are perpetrated by men, and the female clinicians, they worked predominantly with female survivors of sexual assault, they would hear stories of rapes that were perpetrated by men, and this impacted on their appraisals of men in their lives, and it impacted on their relationships with their partners, and also how they parented their daughters. So one of the clinicians said, I expect too often that people will do bad things. And this is illustrated in how I parent my daughters. I will always tell my husband it does not matter if it is her uncle or grandfather. She will not be allowed in the care of just a man, because I've seen so many clients that have been raped by their uncle, father, or grandfather. And I think this speaks to how exposure to trauma work can influence caregiving practices and also increase vigilance around the safety of significant others. Another clinician said, I remember I said to my husband, I'm sure I won't be surprised at you when you have an affair. I'll be surprised if you don't cheat or hurt somebody, which is unfair to him, actually. He has never done anything that would suggest that, but I don't see good men in this work, and I don't hear about good men. So for this clinician, I think that it speaks about how there is a blurring of the boundaries between therapeutic work and how it transfers onto intimate relationships with significant others. One of the distinctive themes that I found was around self-blame, and this was quite unexpected because it hasn't been detailed a lot in the existing literature, and self-blame is something that has predominantly been discussed in relation to the survivor's experience of self-blame. But several of the clinicians in the study spoke about feeling self-blame, and this was partly related to their internalization of the feelings of helplessness and powerlessness experienced by the survivors that they treated. Through close questioning, it was also evident that self-blame was evoked in the context of exposure-based interventions, where to facilitate cognitive processing, the therapist guides the patient to relive aspects of the traumatic event, and it exposes the clinician to the experience of rape in a very lived way. So one of the clinicians said, I always feel complicit. I'm watching these scenes unfold and just standing there and doing nothing. I was trying my best, but it amounted to nothing. Nothing was changing. And this was in the context of an exposure-based intervention. Survivor guilt was also encountered among many of the clinicians in the study, and this was about feeling that they had been, or praising that they had been spared from harm, whereas the people that they see had been exposed to such victimization, and feeling guilty about having lived a sheltered or a protected life. And survivor guilt is quite common also among relatives of people who have experienced traumatic events. The clinicians in the study also spoke about inequity guilt, and that is about feeling guilty about having certain advantages compared to the people that they work with, whether it be financial or relational or otherwise. Intrusive re-experiencing is a core feature of PTSD, and it's commonly encountered among survivors of traumatic events. But the clinicians in the study, all of them spoke about having intrusive memories or intrusive images about the patient's traumatic event. So one of the clinicians treated a woman who had been exposed to childhood sexual abuse, and when this clinician was bathing her young daughters, she was triggered by the naked bodies of her daughters, which reminded her of the experience of this patient. So she said, I could not, this is the clinician, I could not stop thinking about the image of this woman as a 5-year-old girl taken into the spare room by a brother and being sodomized. I struggled to bathe my girls because their naked bodies reminded me of this and what might happen. I struggled with these images that wouldn't stop. For other clinicians, intrusive images of their patient's sexual trauma was triggered when they were sexually intimate with their partners. So one clinician said, intercourse was very painful, and that was also because I would think about the patient's abuse just before we were intimate, or I would get a flashback, and that would be extremely difficult for me. The clinicians in the study also spoke about intrusive re-experiencing in the context of nightmares. So my sleep gets affected. I'll have quite graphic nightmares. They're quite violent, they're graphic, and they're often happening to me. I'm being raped or abused. Avoided coping is frequently used by survivors of traumatic events, and this entails avoidance of situations that remind them of the traumatic event because it evokes emotional distress. But for the treating clinicians in the study, they also spoke about behavioral and emotional disengagement. One of the clinicians spoke about distancing herself emotionally from significant others. So she said, the most adverse effect is I distance myself emotionally. I'm not emotionally emotionally available to friends and family as I used to be, I tend to want to avoid them. It's because of my experience and because of the patients I see and the things that I hear. And I think that this speaks to feeling emotionally depleted and not having any reserves left to hold or to be available or accessible to other people. And behavioral disengagement also occurred in the context of their work. So another clinician said, I would get a physical sensation in my body, a discomfort in my stomach, heart palpitations, thinking that I do not want to work with this patient. Some days when I drive into work, I feel a deep sense of dread. There's a part of me that wants to run for the hills. I started noticing that I was cutting patient interviews short. And I think that this type of behavior, to some extent, it is self-preservational, and it is an attempt to try and limit further emotional exposure to very distressing events. But it speaks to the impact of vicarious trauma on the clinician, but also the impact on patients in terms of the care that they can receive. And cutting interviews short, for example, can detrimentally impact the therapeutic relationship. In addition to discussing the impact or the experience of vicarious trauma with clinicians, it's equally important to focus on how these clinicians actually cope with this type of work and the strategies that they use to sustain themselves, because this is very important work that they undertake. And the clinicians in the study spoke about modulating the exposure to trauma work, and this involved strategies such as not seeing particular types of trauma cases back to back, limiting the number of trauma cases that they see every week. And it also involved cognitive modulation in the context of therapy itself. So one of the clinicians said, I've realized that I need to hold back. I need to self-preserve. So even in the session, I remind myself I'm not them. I'm not going through this. I'm just walking beside them on this part of their journey. Peer supervision was all of the clinicians as central in terms of sustaining them and their ability to continue to undertake this work. And peer supervision, either speaking to colleagues or being part of formal supervision groups, was instrumental in facilitating their coping, in unpacking the type of cases that they work with, and also in helping them to hold the emotional nature of this work. Finally, clinicians spoke about reappraising or positive reappraisal of their work rather than focusing on the negative aspects of their experiences. So one clinician said, what helps me to cope is just to say that what I'm doing is healing. It is not a mere opening of wounds that are going to be left to fester. My role is to help facilitate healing. One of the main implications of this research is around the importance of trauma-informed supervision. Many supervision spaces can focus on a more general form of supervision, but what our work emphasizes is that when it comes to vicarious trauma and vicarious exposure to sexual trauma, the phenomenology is very distinctive, and the cognitive appraisals and the meanings that clinicians derive through this work are very distinctive from other forms of traumatic events. And it's important for supervision of practitioners who engage in trauma work to be grounded in an awareness of the phenomenology of such vicarious trauma. And this entails being aware of the types of cognitive appraisals that can be evoked in trauma work, and also about the adaptive nature of certain coping responses, such as being hypervigilant around one's personal safety, around the safety of significant others who are women, around the safety of their daughters. These responses are not necessarily maladaptive in the context that we live in. They actually represent adaptive coping strategies. And finally, focusing on enhancing clinician awareness of vicarious trauma and the impact of this type of work on themselves, and promoting their authentic expression in the context of supervision and promoting self-care is very important. Finally, I would like to end off with a quote from one of the female clinicians who took part in the study. She said, people come with their trauma, but they bring something else that makes the trauma bearable for the listener. They bear this burden, you share in that load. It's not just left with you, it's the sharing of this load. And I think that this captures the journey of recovery, that the role of the clinician is to bear witness to the suffering of the other, but also to facilitate their healing, their empowerment, and to facilitate the survivor reclaiming their lives. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for being here and for listening.
Anita, thank you so much for sharing this work with us, which is undoubtedly difficult work. And I have sort of a lot going through my mind that I would like to ask you, but before I do, we have a number of people attending your talk today online, which is wonderful to see. And I wonder if there's anyone who would like to pose either a comment or a question to Anita about her presentation this afternoon. Feel free to raise your hand or to simply unmute yourself to ask Anita about his work. So I'm going to give our colleagues a couple of minutes to think about a question or comment for you, and perhaps I can then begin with some of the questions that I had following this work, which is you sort of ended off the presentation with things such as supervision and self-care and all of that being important as ways for psychologists who deal with this type of work to process these experiences. But what are there other sort of things, perhaps from personal experience, that you've also found that have been really helpful to deal with these this sort of vicarious trauma that is experienced? Because it seems to be also very much on an individual level, and the extent to which what is heard within the context of these sessions is also internalized by the therapist.
I think in the context of therapy, it's important to be very self-aware and be attuned to what you are experiencing, and also to be aware of what is your material versus what is the patient's material. And I think that for clinicians who are starting out, it's a very challenging boundary to maintain. And that's why trauma work is a skill that is developed over time, and you build your resources and you build up your capacity to work with these types of cases over time. So it doesn't necessarily get easier, but you are able to hold more the more work that you do. And I think that in terms of self-care, it is so important. I mean, just the basics in terms of taking breaks, taking vacation time off, not having trauma cases back to back, spacing out the number of cases that you see during the week. So simple steps like that can regulate your exposure to these types of this very difficult work, and also help you to cope and to manage the impact of the work on your sense of self and your emotional health.
Yeah. Thank you, Anita. I also see a comment here by Dwayne. Hi, Dwayne. Nice to see you. He said, thank you for the presentation and the good work. Do you know which treatment models, approaches the participants used to treat traumatic stress, directed or non-directed? And do you think structured or manualized treatments could better inoculate clinicians against secondary or vicarious traumatic experience? And then the last part of the comment is, did any contextual variables such as poverty and repeated or continuous exposure complicate or add to the experiences of these clinicians? Thank you, Dwayne, for that comment. Anita.
Thanks, Dwayne, for those 3 questions. So with respect to the first question, with treatment models, I work from a cognitive behavioral orientation. So there are various PTSD or that there are various treatment models for rape survivors, such as cognitive processing therapy. There's also Ellis and Clark's cognitive therapy. And these are the approaches that I draw on in working with survivors of sexual assault. In terms of manualized treatments, I think that manualized treatments, they have a place in the sense that they provide clinicians with a template of what needs to occur. But as you know, the process of therapy is very fluid, and it's important to pace the therapeutic process in terms of what the patient needs at that moment, and developing a collaborative relationship with the patient around your treatment goals. So I think that for manualized treatments, it provides a really good roadmap, but I wouldn't use it as a one-size-fits-all model, and I wouldn't see it as following a manualized treatment approach very strictly to the exclusion or detriment of the patient. So I think it is more about prioritizing the patient's needs and adapting the treatment approach to suit what that patient needs at that point in time. Then your third question, did contextual variables such as poverty and continuous exposure to trauma complicate or add to the experiences of the clinicians? Yes. When it comes to living in circumstances characterized by adversity, poverty, for example, this impacts on the types of resources that are available to patients. Also, if the perpetrator is somebody who is known to the patient and who is in their environment, it's very hard to promote a sense of safety and a therapeutic relationship, because ultimately the patient has to return to an environment where the perpetrator is present. So establishing safety for clinicians is a process that needs to be negotiated with the patient, but also with other relevant professionals such as social workers, liaising with the police services. So these types of contextual factors, they do have an impact on clinicians and on their work with patients, and they do present certain challenges in the context of therapy.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you, Dwayne. Colleagues, I wonder if there are any other comments at this stage. All right, we have two comments here, Anita. If the clinician doesn't seek treatment for this vicarious trauma, what could be the impact that could be transferred onto the patient and helping them in safety? A comment from Ms. Allen.
So one of the consequences of vicarious trauma is that you would develop PTSD-like symptoms. There's also comorbid depression, anxiety. Having vicarious trauma would make it very difficult for a clinician to actually stay present and to provide appropriate therapeutic work. So, and as clinicians, we are all trained to be self-reflective and to be self-aware, to recognize when we are not in the psychological space to be able to hold the distress of another. So I think that in terms of the long-term impact, it's very important for clinicians to be self-reflective and to engage in reflexive practice. Otherwise, it can be detrimental to their patient work. And for the clinicians in the study, some of them spoke about cutting patient interviews short, not feeling able to work with certain types of patients because they just couldn't hold anymore.
Thank you, Anita. Mariam asks, and says that working in forensic psychiatry, offenders were equally affected by vicarious trauma. Are there any existing peer support groups that have been established to assist clinicians with the impact of trauma?
That's a very important area, Miriam. Thank you for raising that. I think a lot of the work on vicarious trauma has focused on the work with the victims. There is very limited work on offenders in terms of vicarious trauma in relation to psychologists who work with offenders or perpetrators of sexual assault. And I think that there would be very distinctive dynamics associated with this. So Miriam, one of my colleagues is Marcel Lond, and she runs groups for sex offenders, and she also provides supportive resources, and she would be a good contact person to liaise with around the peer groups for practitioners who work with sexual offenders. I can send you her details. You can pop me an email. I can give you her details.
Perfect. Thank you, Anita. Any other comments or questions from colleagues who might want to unmute themselves and ask Anita a question? All right, so Anita, perhaps if I could ask you one more, just from my side. In your experience, to what extent does the current professional training that clinical and counselling psychologists receive adequately prepare them for this type of work?
So one of the concepts of vicarious trauma is focused on the work with the victims. There is very limited work on vicarious trauma in relation to psychologists who work with offenders or perpetrators of sexual assault. And I think that there would be very distinctive dynamics associated with this. So think a central part of the training of students involves supervision, and I think that many supervisors, in the context of that supervisory relationship, they are very attuned to what is the student is experiencing, and also in terms of guiding the student to relate what the particular patient is evoking for them. So although we don't have formalized courses, or not necessarily, I'm not sure if it's the case at other institutions, but we don't have a formalized module or a component that focuses on vicarious trauma or what its impact is. But I do know that in the context of supervisory relationships, there is a focus on what working with particular types of clients can evoke for clinicians, and also guiding students in terms of ensuring that they take the necessary steps to self-care and to promote their ability to work effectively in practice.
Thank you so much, Anita. I've just seen a comment from Eugene. Thanks to Anita for such an insightful presentation. I think there are certain things you can identify with, irrespective of being a male practitioner. This is insightful and helpful. So,
thanks so much.
Yeah. So, Anita, thank you once again for this very important and interesting talk, and this very important work that you are engaging in. And I certainly wish you well with all of this research. And I mean, I think it's absolutely essential in helping clinicians to be able to mitigate the effects of this work that is clearly, quite traumatizing to deal with. So I wish you all the best. Colleagues, thank you so much for your time this afternoon and for joining us in this presentation, and we look forward to seeing you next week again for our next colloquium. Thank you, Anita, and thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you so much, colleagues.
Thank you.